Arizona flirts with controversy, another judge rules against a same-sex marriage ban, new defense cuts are proposed, and unrest continues in Venezuela. I'm Simon Harrington, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Simon Harrington. Joining us today are Isaiah Poole of the Campaign for America's Future, Nick Brana, formerly the Terry McAuliffe campaign, and Akil, Alleyne of Young Voices Advocates. First up today is the controversy in Arizona this week. Governor Jan Brewer vetoed a bill that would have made it legal for business owners to refuse service to customers based on the business owner's religious beliefs. Supporters of the law say it's about protecting religious liberty, but opponents liken it to Jim Crow laws. Akil, Alleyne, where do you come down on this issue?
Well, the truth is, I'm very conflicted on this issue because my libertarian philosophy pulls me in one direction, and my realism and certain other considerations I have about equality in society pull me in the opposite direction. In the end, I come down, perhaps reluctantly on some level, but in favor of, in opposition really to the proposed Arizona law. But it is a close run thing. Now, you mentioned that supporters of the law characterize it as being a matter of religious liberty, and that opponents of the law, or many of them, liken it to Jim Crow. I would have to disagree with the opponents on that matter because there's an important difference between a law like this and Jim Crow laws. This law would have made it permissible for business owners in the state of Arizona to refuse service to gay customers, or to refuse to do business with members of the gay community based on their religious convictions. And so it would have allowed them greater latitude, greater personal freedom in the way they operate their businesses. Jim Crow laws, however, denied black and white business owners in the Jim Crow South that freedom alike, because it required all business owners to discriminate based on race, regardless of whether they were willing to accommodate people of all backgrounds on an equal basis. So there is that difference between such a law as the one we see in Arizona and the Jim Crow laws of yesteryear. Now, when supporters of the law talk about religious freedom, they're onto something, because, for better or worse, many people of certain religious backgrounds do believe that homosexuality is a sin. I personally don't agree, and I personally support LGBT rights across the board, but there is another wrinkle to this issue that doesn't often come up in the public discourse. It's the question of property rights. And this is where the libertarian philosophy that I mentioned earlier comes into play. Orthodox libertarianism will say that people have the right to do with their property as they please, as long as they're not harming others. And most libertarians would probably tell you it's despicable for people to discriminate against each other based on sexual orientation, but it's one of those despicable things people should be able to do with their private property, and hopefully the general society's reaction to that will end up giving these business owners an incentive to climb down from that anti-gay position. But at the end of the day, they have the fundamental property right to engage in such discrimination if they see fit to do so. In the end, I come down narrowly against such a law because I think that there are limits to property rights. My libertarianism stems from the no harm principle, which basically holds that one should be able to do as one pleases without harming others. It's not clear, crystal clear, whether denying someone the ability to shop in one store is the kind of harm that government should intervene to stop people from inflicting. But given the challenges that people of LGBT backgrounds face in this country, given that there are vast swaths of the country where business owners who are anti-gay can get away with such discrimination without facing boycotts or what have you, I'm willing to make this particular compromise with orthodox libertarianism in this particular context.
Okay, Nick or Isaiah, would either of you like to comment?
Well, I think the parallel to Jim Crow laws to me is this. Number one, remember that much of Jim Crow was based on a religious objection, on basically a theology that held that either black people were inferior, or if they were not inferior, they were at least not to be mixed with white people. And so if you say then that today you can have, by a religious objection, deny someone a public accommodation. That's why we had the public accommodations fight. If you deny a public accommodation based on religious grounds, that opens up, the entire can of worms of people saying, I can deny you, based on a religious objection, access to a public venue, a public business, because of race, because you're not, because you are of another religion, of any number of things. That's a can of worms that Governor Brewer in Arizona wisely did not open. And I think she was dead on. We hold religious liberty as being very important, a core principle in this country. That's why when I fought in support of marriage equality here in the District of Columbia, I was part of that fight. And one of the things that we did very early on was to say to the religious community that you will not be required to participate in the ceremony. You will not be required to suppress a particular viewpoint that you have about marriage equality or about gay and lesbian people. If you want to preach on your pulpit that homosexuality is a sin, you can do that, and people in the District of Columbia do. But you cannot say to the government that it is okay to deny a certain set of people a set of privileges, legal privileges, that you award to the rest of the population.
Okay, Nick, where do you come down on this issue?
I agree, and I would add a couple things to that. Firstly, who decides what a religion is? This logic has no end in my mind, because on this basis, Quakers were forced to go to war in Vietnam. If this is the logic that you operate on, you could say, I don't believe in taxes. I don't believe in this, that taxes is funding. So I'm not going to pay my taxes. I don't believe in in preventing animal cruelty. That says part of my religion says that I should sacrifice animals, including my neighbor's pets. What is the government going to do? So that's the first thing I would add. The logic is really flawed, and it is really a throwback to kind of Jim Crow and segregation days. The second thing that I would add is that this is part of a really concerted tactic by the right wing, by the Tea Party and its corporate financiers, to push the debate rightwards, to shift the spectrum to the right. And regardless of how it comes out, of how this particular initiative comes out, or the anti-immigration discriminatory measures that came out of Arizona previously, regardless of how those things turns out, it shifts the debate rightward, because it creates a new extreme that makes the already very destructive market fundamentalism of conservative mainstream Republicans, that's already very destructive, it makes it seem more reasonable and sensible.
Akil, anything you would like to add?
Well, Nick makes some very good points about the foundation of this particular law in religious liberty. I can tell you libertarians in general probably wouldn't base a law with similar provisions on the religious liberty premise. The idea would be individuals have the right to do what they please with their property, regardless of what the motive is, religious or otherwise. And so, Nick makes a lot of good points. It would open up a certain policy can of worms to pass a law such as this, because that's one of the challenges you always face when it comes to questions of religious accommodation. how are we supposed to know that a particular person is not simply cynically citing some made up or fabricated religious belief in order to escape the strictures of the law? So, I agree with that critique. I maintain that the law is not tantamount to what we saw in the Jim Crow era, and I would just respond to a point that Isaiah made. While I'm aware that defenders of racial segregation constantly paid lip service to Christianity as a justification for it and for the system of white supremacy across the board, I don't think that you can actually sort of objectively situate the system of white supremacy in this country within the actual Christian tradition, within Scripture, for example, in the way that you can with the opposition to homosexuality, where, in black and white, in various parts of the Old and New Testaments, you see these condemnations of homosexuality.
And I don't disagree with you on that point. But here's kind of what concerns me about the road that you're going down, which I think is a very real issue when considering the fact that we have a person like Rand Paul, who's one of the leaders in the 2016 presidential race, the senator from Kentucky, who has said that he would not have supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964 precisely because he did not think private property owners should be forced to serve people who they did not want to serve. Which raises the question. Would we have not had a housing? Should we not have housing rights laws? Should an apartment owner not be able to decide that, okay, I've got this apartment building, but I don't want to rent to Muslims, I don't want to rent to gay people, I don't want to rent to women, I don't want to rent to whomever. Is that the road we want to go down as a country? Is that acceptable public policy?
To that point, I'd like to also add that you can't neatly separate the private institutions and public institutions. Private institutions here, they subsist off of an infrastructure that all of us pay into. So it's not as simple as delineating their rights, from those of the majority.
Well, I would say that argument risks opening up a can of worms, because then you could restrict all sorts of individual freedoms that even folks on the left support, based on the fact that we participate in, we all benefit from public infrastructure and things of that nature. Why not impose all sorts of restrictions on abortion or the provision of abortion services on the grounds that abortion clinics are part of the public sphere and they benefit from subsidies in some cases, a number of public services, public infrastructure, and things of that nature. If we were...
Even those of us who support the right to choose will say that an abortion clinic should be clean, it should have certain quality, the doctor should have a license, and those kinds of things.
Well, naturally, but
so we in fact do support the fact that we
what you support, what you define as reasonable regulations of such conduct that you think is, a fundamental right. Yes. Well, my point is, a lot of folks on the other side would cite many of those same considerations to the contrary. But the larger point I was trying to make was one that you also mentioned in your commentary.
One last point, and then I think we'll finish this. We'll finish this topic.
You describe these as public accommodations, and they're public in the sense that they serve members of the general public, but they are still privately owned establishments. And and this speaks to the point I just made in response to Nick's comment. If we look at the gray area between public and private institutions and blur it to that extent, we could create, a justification for all sorts of government intrusions that I think even folks on the left would find anathema.
And I would argue that that private institutions that serve the public have a public obligation.
Okay, we'll leave that as the last word on this one. All right, I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Okay, let's move on. Also this week, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel unveiled plans to cut the size of the military, and this comes on top of previous cuts as well as those imposed by sequestration. Akil, is the military bloated, or are these cuts dangerous to national security?
I think the military is bloated, frankly. Now, let's look at the facts surrounding military spending by this country, right? this country spends more than the next 10 biggest military spenders, from China at the top of the list to Brazil at the bottom of that list, combined. Now, if you look at the strategic situation that the United States faces and that the international community as a whole faces, you'll find that the biggest challengers to U.S. national security, whether in the short term or the long term, are countries such as Russia and China, right? Russia and China structurally don't face anything, I should say they face challenges of the kind that the United States has never faced and never will face simply because of geography. Both countries are surrounded by neighbors that are very deeply suspicious of them and that are closely allied with the United States and many of its other allies. You've got countries such as Japan and Taiwan, where the U.S. has large military bases and large military presences that I think will do a good job of deterring any aggression by a country such as China. And that's just one example. If you look at non-state actors and the potential threat they pose to national security, it's far from clear that maintaining this massive military-industrial establishment that's so well-funded, so exorbitantly funded, is really necessary to fight against people who will try to attack this country by perhaps sneaking small arms across the border or by hijacking airplanes with knives and box cutters. So, I don't really buy the whole case that a lot of defenders of the national security state like to make, that we need to keep defense spending at least as high as it is now, if not jacking it up even higher, because any cut to U.S. defense spending is going to be detrimental to national security. From what I understand, Secretary Hagel's plan is to cut the Army to pre-9/11 levels, to axe a number of old weapons programs, some of which date back to the early days of the Cold War, and to cut spending by approximately $75 billion over 2 years. This is out of a $680-something billion military budget. I have a hard time believing that such a modest cut is really going to endanger U.S. national security.
Oh, I don't disagree with you at all.
Yeah.
The one thing that I would add, and this is the thing that does concern me a bit, is that there has been in this budget an unfortunate tendency to cut funding that would go to people and that would support people, but not a cut to support weapons and machinery and tanks and weapon systems and so on. So Lockheed and the other major defense manufacturers kind of get a pass, but we still have tens of thousands of military people whose families still rely on food stamps and government assistance, which really, I think, should be unfathomable. It should be, why do we have a person in the military whose family has to get supplemental nutrition assistance every month? That seems silly to me, and it should seem outrageous to any American taxpayer. We should, the whole debate over cutting retirement benefits for retirees was I agree, a very ridiculous discussion. We shouldn't have needed to do that. There is a lot of bloat in weapon systems, and frankly, some of the edifices that we built in Afghanistan, we ought to be asking for money back from the guys who built those things, and we give that money to the families who are struggling to protect our country. That's what I'd like to see.
Nick, anything you'd like to add on this topic?
Yeah, you listen to some of the people in the military empire that we have, and these cuts have been so sensationalized. I mean, it amounts to a 10% cut. And when you dig a little bit deeper, you really look into their methodology. Then you begin to ask yourself. Then you see what are they predicating this massive spending on? And they say, and so you had Secretary Hagel saying things like, we would no longer be able to fight two large land wars at once. Well, I think we need to be asking ourselves, is that really something that with the standard that we need to be attaching our military spending to? And then there's the question of so many outdated technologies, too. A lot of our military hardware is produced and immediately sent to junkyards, or immediately sent to military junkyards in Arizona, where they aren't used at all. And you also need to look at where are these cuts coming from? And the recent earnings and the stock reports for companies like Raytheon that are these military industrial contractors, they're not the ones who are being hit by this. It's really the public wing of the military industrial complex that's being hit by this. I think that Eisenhower's parting warning in 1961 was, beware the potential rise of a massive military industrial complex that's going to affect every aspect of our society. And that's a warning that has decidedly fallen on deaf ears. After the Cold War ended, 23 years ago now, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the talk was about peace dividends, it's not discussed anymore, but it was peace dividends, that all of a sudden now the Soviet Union collapsed and we're going to be able to return the money back to the people. We're going to be able to focus once again, on our American charitable, generous ideals. And you look at spending; it's only increased after the Soviet Union collapsed. I think that's totally inexcusable.
Well, what has
Huge
happened?
waste.
What has happened? We do have a bipartisan problem.
Oh,
And
yes.
the bipartisan problem is that military spending connects itself to almost every congressional district in some way or another. And when you start talking about military cuts, you are talking about people having to get up and say, you know what, this thing in my district that gives me, that
Helps you get reelected.
helps me get reelected,
Employs
I'm
people.
going to have to look objectively at that and say, well, it's not really needed today as it was 20 years ago. And too many of our members of Congress on both sides of the aisle can't bring themselves to do that. That's why I think we really do need a separate progressive populist movement, and some of our libertarian friends can join us to say, let's let's look objectively at the fact that we are in the 21st century. We have a different set of threats. We do not need the military of the 1950s or the 1980s to address the 21st century threats. We're in a different world, and we should really be spending our hard-earned tax dollars on things that we really need and not just bloated military.
And the opportunity cost of this is massive. I mean, it's
Massive.
$4.2 trillion that we spent on in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The thing to remember, I would say, is a lot of the resistance that we're seeing to cutting military spending is fundamentally similar to the resistance you'll see whenever there are efforts to cut spending in almost any area of the federal budget, because every block of federal spending has its beneficiaries. And one of the points that we libertarians like to make is that government spending to benefit certain, what are often called special interest groups, will always create situations in which the costs of that spending are dispersed among all taxpayers, but the benefits of it are concentrated by being funneled toward a certain narrow category of beneficiaries. And those beneficiaries will always create powerful lobbies to try to keep the gravy train rolling, if not to increase it. And that applies to military spending just as much as it applies to social spending, various forms of corporate welfare, which we libertarians oppose for a number of reasons. And so as in the military context, as in other contexts, we need to make a concerted, persuasive case to the people directly that, yes, when there are cuts, there will be some pain, especially in the short term. There will be what they often call losers, but in the end, society as a whole will end up better off for it.
Well, what I was going to say is that the one thing that I certainly can't say is that the voice of a military contractor on Capitol Hill is equal to the voice of a single mother on supplemental nutrition assistance funding. I mean, it's night and day, and that's why it's very easy for Congress to pass a bill that cut it was like about $10 billion out of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the food stamp program, but we're not getting the cuts that would affect Lockheed Martin.
$40 billion. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, money talks in this Congress, and we need to tell money somehow to shut up. And
we need to start framing this, like I was saying, as the opportunity cost. I mean, the things that we could have done, for that $4.2 trillion are incredible. We could have provided free higher education to everybody at all institutions in the United States, 4-year and 2-year institutions, for 52 years. 52 years. That's what you're up against. Pre-K, I mean, that would have been a drop in that bucket, universal pre-K that Obama, that he likes to talk about, and unfortunately we've made no progress in. We could have also put solar panels on every home in the United States. I mean, the things we could have done for that money is just incredible. It's totally unjustifiable.
All right, we'll have to make that last word on that one, but you'll get the first word on the next one. Finally, the unrest in Venezuela continues. The government seems to be digging in, with several protesters being arrested or killed. Nick, what, if anything, should the U.S. do about Venezuela?
I think this can be tied to a failure of policy in Latin America, on our part. I mean, there's only so much we can do to influence them, but at the same time, there has been this neoliberal Washington consensus of how Latin American countries should be treated and are treated. For a long time, it was our backyard. Everything south of us in the Americas was considered and thought of as America's backyard. And that's a Cold War mentality of the leaders that are still in office today. During Reagan's time, during the 80s and before then, if we didn't like what a Latin American country was doing, if it wasn't opening its markets to our corporations, we just went in there and we overthrew the government. That's what we did. And usually we installed a right-wing military junta in its place. And our thinking still hasn't departed that line. But the problem is that we no longer do that. Those countries have freed themselves from dependence on U.S. companies and U.S. markets. So we need to approach this in a new way, because it's really costing us now. We're the real losers of this policy now, of this antiquated thinking, because they have options now. They've formed Banco del Sur so that they can escape kind of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs. They're finishing paying off their World Bank IMF loans. They're escaping kind of, crushing debt. IMF loans, they would be paying 50% of their GDP, 50% of their government spending would be going towards paying off just the interest on those loans. It was crushing. It wasn't allowing them to develop. Now they've freed themselves from that.
Okay.
They formed CELAC, which is an organization that'll probably replace the OAS. So it's really, we're the ones who are losing from this approach now.
Okay, so we can get to our viewers' questions. Akil, is there anything you would like to say to Nick's?
I sympathize with most, if not all of it. What should we do about Venezuela? I think, in a nutshell, we should focus on making it possible for anyone fleeing the turmoil in Venezuela to come here, to escape that turmoil where the need for that escape is shown, rather than seeking to intervene forcibly in the country, meddle in its internal politics, risk engendering even more anti-American sentiment, not only within Venezuela, but throughout Latin America and the rest of the world.
Sure.
And possibly making a situation worse and costing even more lives.
Isaiah, quickly.
Well, that would be an interesting policy if we allowed Venezuelans and plus the refugees of other trouble spots around the world to come into the United States. That would certainly raise the hackles of a lot of people on the right who are trying to raise the borders rather than lower them and honor what the Statue of Liberty means.
All right, let's get to some of our questions from our viewers. The first one comes from Dallas Jacobs, and he would like to know, wouldn't it make more sense to scale back our military commitments before cutting funding rather than cutting funding first? Anybody?
Well, that's kind of what we've ended Iraq. We're to the consternation, by the way, of some people on the Hill right now, actually on the right. We are rapidly unwinding Afghanistan, largely and primarily because Ahmed Karzai is unwilling to enter into a long-term agreement with us that we can honor and feel comfortable with. So those commitments are going down, and we are President Obama has today sent a very strong signal to the Ukraine, but that signal does not include that we would step into that in any direct way. So I think that is actually playing out.
Nick?
The level of our military spending is totally unconnected to the actual expenditures that go towards what we're doing abroad. Frankly, I think we need to ask the question that comes before that, which is, should we be doing those things to begin with? Okay. I think the drone program has no legal precedent, and it's very dangerous. When other countries acquire drones, we've set a precedent that literally says, the Bush Doctrine, that if you're harboring terrorists or if we don't like what you're doing, we can frankly go inside your country, violate your sovereignty, and drone yourself. So, but there's no connection to the level of spending and what we're actually using abroad.
All right, and Maggie Mendoza would like to know, do any of you really believe a large number of businesses would put up no gays allowed signs if they were allowed to?
I don't know whether or not they would put up signs. But, I mean, there have been cases of certain business owners who profess to have religious motivations, and in those cases, frankly, I believe them. I think they are sincerely motivated by Christian teachings, who have said, we're not going to do business with gay... well, I've heard of people not wanting to do business with gay customers, such as, I think there was a bakery case out west, for example. So I don't know whether, businesses are going to put up signs, literally, saying no gays wanted. Now, I think what the questioner might be alluding to is the likelihood that businesses that engage in that kind of discrimination openly are going to pay a commercial price for it. There will be enough people in the marketplace, enough consumers who will find that discrimination despicable that they will effectively boycott the business and urge others to join them. I don't doubt that there will be at least some people who will react that way, but part of the reason why this is one of the areas where I compromise with my libertarian principles is that I don't think that'll be the case on a widespread enough basis. There are, if you look throughout the Bible Belt and so on, you'll find large parts of the country where most members of local communities will probably agree with this anti-gay discrimination, and so the perpetrators, those who engage in the discrimination, will be able to get away with it, if not profit from it. And the environment that creates for the treatment of gay people is something that I think arguably outweighs the property rights consideration.
But keep in mind that it is legal in America to not hire someone because of their perceived sexual orientation. You don't even have to, again, even know that a person is gay. If I think you're not macho enough, I could deny you a job. That's legal today. And you would have no federal recourse if I made that decision. In many states, my spouse and I, when we travel, and my spouse and I have been married for 3 years, and when my spouse and I travel, of course, we book a hotel together, and it's quite likely that when the two of us walk into and we get our hotel room, that the person behind the counter will look at us and say, I'm not going to rent a room to two men who are sharing a single bed. Even though I'm legally married in the District of Columbia. So the answer to that question, is it likely? Yeah, it's likely.
It is likely. Nick?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think this is kind of part of this kind of like hyper-federalist effort, that's really coming down from large corporate donors nowadays. Really, the federal area in Congress is stalled. There's nothing happening there, and so you've seen a lot of funds diverted to the state and the local level from right-wing kind of advocacy groups and this networks of NGOs, that trace themselves back to the Koch brothers or to Sheldon Adelson. So I think it's really this question of, do you want this like hyper-federalized United States, where there's just there's 50 different countries, and a Puerto Rico, so yeah.
I kind of think they do, actually.
I think they do too.
Actually, let me just say very quickly, a lot of the folks who profess to believe in federalism are actually just paying lip service to it when it suits them and are happy to violate it when it doesn't, such as when it comes to, I don't know, states wanting to legalize marijuana or what have you. So if you want, let me just say very quickly, if you want a more consistent approach to federalism and what's often erroneously called states' rights, look to libertarian literature rather than conservative literature. We'll have a much more reliable and a consistent approach to that issue than most conservatives typically do.
Right. This time he gets the last word. All right. Now, I want to hear your. We need to hear your most underreported stories. Nick, why don't you start? Underreported story of the week.
Okay. I was between a couple stories when I really was going to talk about 715 planets that were recently discovered by Kepler. But something happened yesterday that I think people really should be talking about, and it's that the second member of the Cuban Five was released. The Cuban Five were an organization it was a group of 5 Cuban intelligence agents that exposed terrorists being harbored by the United States who had blown up an airliner, killing 78 people, 73 Cubans, in 1976. They were also responsible, the same people, for 1997 bombing in Havana. And those people, what the Cubans revealed, this Cuban 5 intelligence agents, they turned over 175 documents to the FBI that revealed that the CIA had trained those terrorists that had done that, and that they were responsible for that. And I think that's something that we should be talking about, because Cuba has faced more terrorist attacks than any country in the world, frankly, and a lot of them have been funded by the CIA. They have they're tracing back to that, because during the Cold War, the United States couldn't stand the idea that there was a communist nation 90 miles away off our shore.
Okay. Isaiah, your most underreported story.
Well, I'm a transportation nerd, so I was in heaven when President Obama this week unveiled his transportation plan for the next 4 years. He has proposed that, among other things, a $600 billion transportation plan for 4 years. That may be the only jobs plan that we see out of the administration this year that has a half of a chance to get through Congress. And the deadline, the reason for that is that there is a deadline. Funding for state transportation projects, highways, surface transportation, public transportation, expires in October 1st. And so Congress has this deadline. It collects a gasoline tax now. Everybody that buys gasoline pays about 18.5 cents to the federal government and goes into a highway trust fund. That goes away at the end of September 30th, at the end of September, if Congress doesn't renew it. And so President Obama has stepped in with this proposal, some of which will be paid for by some unspecified tax reform revenue that a lot of us are concerned about, because one of the proposals out there is to allow corporations that have parked money overseas to bring back that money if they buy into a infrastructure bank. And we're very suspicious of that proposal because it rewards corporations that have parked money overseas to evade taxes.
Okay,
so we're going to have a fight on that.
I have to keep track of that one. Akil, your most underreported story.
My story is about a decision that came down from the Supreme Court earlier this week in the case of Cayley versus the United States. It expands police power, the power of the police, to seize or freeze defendants' assets before they're actually convicted of a crime. In the case, which concerned a married couple who were accused of selling stolen medical supplies for profit and laundering the proceeds, the DA's office actually froze the defendants' assets because they had already shown to a grand jury's satisfaction that there was probable cause that those monies were connected to the illegal activity of which the defendants were accused. So the defendants wanted to use some of that money to pay for their legal services. They needed to pay their lawyers to defend them in court. And so they sought a new hearing where they would be able to show that maybe there actually wasn't probable cause, that this money was connected to the crime and therefore could be forfeited, as they say, which is to say seized after a criminal conviction. But the freeze remained in place, and the Supreme Court decided earlier this week that that was actually permissible, that it wasn't a violation of the constitutional rights. And, for someone like me who is very skeptical of the power of law enforcement and wants to keep it limited and trammeled, I'm troubled by this decision, because in a situation like this where defendants need to get their hands on at least some of their assets so that they can pay their legal bills and, get an adequate legal defense in court, this rule could actually end up hampering the exercise of other constitutional rights. And just very quickly, one of the major problems with the court's ruling is that in grand jury proceedings, the defendant doesn't get any representation. They don't get to speak out and to challenge the prosecution's assertions of probable cause. The grand jury decides that on its own. The prosecution gets a voice, the defense not so much. So that was a case that I think should have gotten more attention in the media.
Okay, all very interesting stories that we'll have to keep track of. All right, that's all for this week, and thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.